Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, a Senior Internal Audit Advisor for Audit Board, and welcome to my series, Agents of Change. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Lee. I've known Lisa for a long time. She's the Vice President of Audit at Alphabet Google, where she established the 𝗧𝗔𝗕𝗟𝗧𝗦 compliance program and the internal audit function. Lisa has 25 years of audit, finance, and system implementation experience. Prior to joining Google, she worked for OpenTV, Cisco Systems, SAP, and KPMG. Lisa, it's great to see you, and thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
I remember when I came to visit you and your staff out at Google a few years ago, just how exciting it was, because it was obvious that you were forging an entirely new direction for internal audit in the organization there. In my book, Agents of Change, I make the case that internal auditors should be change agents, and I define change agents for internal audit as catalysts for transformation that creates value and changes the organizations that internal auditors serve in. First of all, do you agree that that's an appropriate role for internal audit, and is that how you would define a change agent in the internal audit profession?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you said the key words there around being able to add value. And I think, you mentioned that we were doing this. I think we had no choice, right? At Google, things were moving so quickly and the environment was changing so dynamically that if we weren't adaptable, if we weren't, change agents, as you say, we wouldn't be adding value in any way. I mean, I think the ultimate responsibility of internal audit is to ensure that company can achieve its strategic objectives and goals in a compliant and risk-managed way. And part of that responsibility must be to ensure the company is prepared given the dynamic environment that we live in and operate today, with technology and system advancements, evolving regulatory landscape, and the unexpected environmental impacts to operations, such as the pandemic we're living through. I mean, if we can't adapt to these things, then I don't know how we continue to add value, right? And so to do this, internal audit has to get in early to understand how the organization is adapting to these changes. Well, what we found in Google is that if the business is prepared, that's great. Our audit efforts will provide assurance and comfort that the company will be prepared to respond to whatever comes its way. But if they're not prepared, then the audit will help influence change. You're able to identify gaps and be included in their plans to continue to evolve, right? And so I think to define what internal audit as a change agent, I define it as a professional who understands the risk landscape of the business, gets in early to assess how the business plans to mitigate and manage these risks, and provides insights and assurance to the risk management capabilities to influence change and ensure appropriate response as possible.
That's a great definition, a great way of looking at it, and certainly in the environment that you've operated in there at Google over the years. I mean, you've seen such extraordinary change even within the organization itself. But how does management react to internal audit as agents of change? You sort of made the comment earlier, that internal audit particularly in the technology industry kind of needs to either move with the organization or stand aside. How does management see internal audit?
Yeah, I would say even more than stand aside, you almost get left behind if you're not sort of moving with the business. And so again, I think we talked about the key is adding value. And so I can't imagine management or the board not wanting an organization that they're investing in to add value. And of course, it's important to do that in the context of internal audit's mandate. And so I've found that management and our board is receptive to this approach as it allows the opportunity for risk to be proactively managed and addressed versus being reactive. I mean, if internal audit engages after a process and systems have been built, then you're reworking things and you're redoing things. So in cases where we haven't been able to get in early at Google and we've audited after, let's say, a launch of a system, and we have our stakeholders tell us, gosh, I wish you'd come in earlier, because that would have saved us a whole lot of time if you were, walking alongside us, talking to us about risk, getting us to think differently and proactively about certain things. And so, I don't necessarily see it as that, internal audit is doing things for them, but it is sort of thinking ahead and asking the same questions that you would have asked in the back end, but just while they're building.
In the book, I argue the point that before internal audit can really be change agents within the organization they serve, they have to be open to changing internal audit itself. You have to, I think the title of the chapter is, Agent Change Thyself. What are some of the things that you've done in internal audit there at Google to keep internal audit agile and changing as you've helped to lead the growth?
Yeah, I think it starts at the most basic level of auditor expectations and training, as well as determining what areas you need to focus in from an audit perspective. I mean, given the work that we do, auditors can sometimes, I think, gravitate towards eliminating risk or even making sure there's really structured processes for them to operate within and predictability. But in order to effectively operate in a dynamic environment, it's important to be, one, comfortable navigating ambiguity, make decisions in a timely manner with incomplete or imperfect information. Like, it's really an iterative process of, even when you're conducting an audit, right, of sensing what's needed, gathering data and moving forward and repeating that process, right? And then, of course, understanding the appropriate risk tolerance based on feedback from critical stakeholders. And so that focus is really important to have a pragmatic approach and solution given the risk levels versus making sure we have a perfect solution. And I think sometimes, historically, we want to plan everything. We want to be able to execute. And as you have layers in your team, it's like this chain of command. You want to be able to, have more details down below. But what we found is that you need a really iterative process. You need the whole team talking. Communication is key, right? So that they understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, so they can change as necessary, right? I think it's also important to ensure that the audit plan is anchored in a risk-based approach. We've spent a lot of time working on developing our audit plan based on the results of our annual risk assessment that it identifies the top risks of the company. That way, again, when we go to audit, if there's any observations that we're identifying, management is already aligned because it's already related to something that's really important to them, right? Yeah. So while we may execute our audits and work based on processes, I think our leaders aren't interested in hearing about processes necessarily. They want to engage about talking about risk management and how well are they prepared in managing those risks.
And that may be, a characteristic that you get to take advantage of in the technology industry, because I can tell you other industries where I've had some exposure, management would often much rather talk about processes than risk management because they're just more comfortable having the internal auditors play that traditional role of looking at policies and processes and procedures than telling them what they do and don't know about risk.
Yeah, and I think what we've tried to do at Google is to marry the two concepts, right? We've tried to create this concept called storyboarding, where we start with the risk, but then obviously how we execute, as I mentioned, how you execute our audits is based on processes. So our audit plans it's basically, again, we're still iterating on this, right? But it's a document that shows risk on one axis, and then your processes or auditable entities or your whatever, however you look at your world of audit. Right. And then we identify what audits we're doing and how those risk areas touch those different process areas, because it does come back to how you execute the work that we need to do. I mean, I've definitely encouraged, many that I've talked to in the regulated environment to, again, launch and iterate, to explore and experiment, right, to see what's possible.
Now, I remember the first time you were telling me about the storyboarding approach that you guys used and how awesome it was. It just seemed so innovative and so different from the way a lot of internal audit departments do their very routine methodological auditing.
We found success in communicating with our stakeholders with it, because they want to understand. What we've tried to do at in Google is move quickly. But if you're moving quickly, sometimes we call it, we're taking, pieces of a process, right? And how do you ensure that you're not overwhelming the business with, a multitude of paper cuts, or I call it death by 1,000 cuts. They're seeing, little bits and pieces. But if you're explaining to them the story of how your audit is going to help address the risks, then they understand how all those pieces come together, right? Excellent. And I also feel like by taking pieces of the puzzle, you're giving them information on a more timely and regular basis so that they can also react. I mean, the goal isn't for audit to say, I got you. The goal for audit is to say, I've given you insight so that you can now take the learnings and the insights and continue to adapt and evolve your processes and be ready.
It's not to say I got you, it's to say I helped you.
Yes, absolutely.
I talk a lot about capacity multipliers as a way for internal audit departments to create greater capacity to do audit and coverage and address more risks, even if their resources aren't increasing sizably. One of the great capacity multipliers that I always point to is technology. Using technology within the internal audit function. Are there some ways that you guys have used technology that you're particularly proud of?
I wish I could say we've done more. Obviously, honestly, it's an area that we haven't invested in as much as I'd like to. Obviously, it takes time, right? And it takes away from, actually doing audits. So it's something that, we continue to plan on investing in. But the one area, or two, I guess, two main ways that we have invested in is, I would say, investing in our technology audit skills. So recognizing that the more tech savvy our auditors are, the more they can not only apply, but interpret technological advancements in areas that they're auditing, is that they can, learn to sample better, learn to actually execute the audits better by writing scripts, right? And then secondly, investing in data science. I mean, this has been critical to us to help inform how we approach an audit or continue, as well as given the increase in AI and ML models that we come across in our audits. I think being able to, develop some of those technologies within our own team and apply them has been incredibly useful.
Well, it sounds like you guys have made a lot of great investments there in technology. So don't sell yourself short. You've made some tremendous strides there. In researching for the Agents of Change book, we surveyed more than 600 chief audit executives from around the world, and we synthesized their views of what does it take to be a real change agent in internal audit. And in the end, we boiled it down to four broad attributes or characteristics that we kind of focus on in the book. Business acumen, strategic mindset, relationship-centric, and innovative. Are there any others that jump out at you that you look for when you're looking for someone to come into internal audit and you want to make sure that that person's going to come in with this change agent mindset?
I would add flexible mindset and adaptability. I know we've talked a little bit about it, and some may include that in being innovative in the category that you've talked about already. But I think it's slightly different, since most of us think of innovation as coming up with new ideas or better ways to do things. Well, that only works if you are comfortable with a launch and iterate approach, right? And what makes that process successful is being okay with failure and failing. And so you can only, I think that, to me, translating ability to fail and learn from it is having a flexible mindset and adaptability. I've always tried to get auditors thinking about what is the difference between waste and R&D, as an example. And at its extremes, I think it's obvious, but there are times where it's more likely about intent, and that's not always clear. So auditors need to be flexible, right, and not fear failure, and being adaptable. And so they can't think about things that go wrong as waste.
Lisa, before I finish, I want to just give you a chance to kind of look ahead. I get asked a lot, what do I think are the big challenges and opportunities for internal audit in the decade ahead? No one can look farther out than 3 or 4 years probably in this day and age. But if I ask you to look ahead and say, what do you think the things that internal auditors should be looking to achieve, or what are some opportunities that lie in front of us as a profession? What would jump to your mind?
I would tie them together in the sense that I would say acquiring talent and keeping our talent is going to be really challenging as we move forward in the future. The skills that we've talked about, I think, are in high demand, and they can be applied across many different professions, right? So I think that being change agents can help us attract that talent in the type of work that we do. I think people are always interested in, learning something new. And if we're always sort of looking backwards, I think that will be challenging in acquiring and retaining talent. And then turning to opportunities, I think then biggest opportunity for us is how do we develop some of that talent, right? I think that there's an opportunity to train our auditors to be more technically savvy and innovating the way that we do things, right? And I think if we can invest in that and encourage them to think about It's partially like being a consultant in some sense, right? I want to be careful in how I phrase that, because obviously, as I mentioned, we have a mandate and a role that we have to fulfill. But I think the skills and the techniques that consultants utilize is something that we can as well in the audit process. So engaging them in the business, understanding the strategic objectives, I think that is going to keep our auditors interested in the profession.
Those are great answers. Lisa, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I know you've got a lot of things that you're working on, and you have a very full plate. So thank you for making time to talk with us here on our Agents of Change series. And I wish you really great luck in continuing to foster that culture of change at Google.
Thank you very much, and thank you for continuing to bring this topic to the industry and making sure that it stays in the forefront of our minds and we continue to evolve.